The real world is full of inconvenient truths, but in the grim darkness of the far future, the truth is forbidden. The Imperium of Man uses everything it can to subjugate its own people, and it has to. Its vast armies spend more time crushing rebellions than fighting aliens or demons, but they're just one weapon in a much larger arsenal. When the God Emperor of mankind launched his great crusade to unite the stars by force, he wasn't just building an empire, he was building a system to keep it. A system that shapes through thought, controls faith, and rewrites history itself. So strap in for another deep dive into the Imperium. We're about to explore the many ways it controls the hearts, the minds, and the fates of countless trillions across 1 million worlds. I don't think there's an official colour for the Imperium. Maybe grey? But if the Imperium had to choose, I'd say it would be gold. Why not? They're number one after all, at least in their own minds. Gold is used throughout the Imperium, mainly by some of its most high-ranking figures like the Adeptus Custodes. The most important use of gold in the entire setting, though, is definitely the Golden Throne itself. This is the actual seat of the Emperor of Mankind. The throne both is and is not well described in the lore of Warhammer 40k. On the one hand, it is an actual throne. It's a physical thing where the Emperor sits, but it's much more than just a chair. It's also the most advanced life support mechanism in the galaxy. It has kept the Emperor alive in a state of near death for 10,000 years. Nobody knows exactly how it operates, and some of the writers have described it as looking like the inside of a nuclear reactor. In the Agents of the Throne novel series, one of the best 40k series in my opinion, hint, the word throne is in the name, yeah? We learn there's a plot at the very heart of the Imperium that revolves around the Golden Throne. Spoilers ahead. The throne has kept the Emperor alive for so long by absorbing the life force of thousands of psychers every single day. More than that, it allows the Emperor to guide the Astronomicon, which helps ships navigate through the warp, like a lighthouse in the storm. A huge part of the plot revolves around the fact that nobody, not even the highest-ranking members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, actually knows how the Golden Throne works. It uses technology gathered over millennia from all over the galaxy, including sources that are non-human. Even though the Golden Throne is one of the most advanced pieces of technology in the setting, it's more than just a machine. It's an idea, a concept that lives in the hearts and the minds of countless billions. The characters and agents of the throne are literally agents of the throne. They derive their authority from it. Indeed, almost any sanctioned imperial authority comes from the throne. It functions like a form of office. Orders from the highest echelons of the Imperium are said to come from the throne. The Golden Throne is so important, it's seen as the source of the Emperor's continued existence, the safety of Terra, as it helps to contain the warp rift beneath it, and the Imperium's continued ability to travel between the stars. But its importance goes deeper, even to the very way that people speak and communicate to one another. It's also a perfect example of how the Imperium uses language to reinforce control over the population of the Milky Way galaxy. There are a couple of main languages used in the Imperium of Man. Now, obviously, in a setting that spans 1 million worlds, there are far more languages than could ever really be conceived of by a writer, or even the fans of the setting. However, when you read stories and codices set in Warhammer 40k, you'll come across a few languages mentioned frequently. The Warhammer Universe's version of Latin is High Gothic. You have to remember a couple of things here. First of all, 40k was originally written to be Warhammer Fantasy in space. In Warhammer Fantasy, the main human faction is the Empire, which is heavily influenced by the Holy Roman Empire in medieval Germany. So some of that Germanic influence crept into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The other thing that was definitely considered when creating the setting was the role of Latin in medieval Europe. Latin was the lingua franca, used mainly by the clergy at the time. While it was in reality a dead language, its use allowed people from totally different cultures and languages to communicate. It made sense practically. I think the reason Games Workshop chose a language to fit a similar function was to evoke medieval imagery. It shows that even tens of thousands of years in the future, mankind has actually gone backwards, in at least a few ways. You see, in other works of fiction like Star Trek, there are universal translators. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's the Babelfish. But of course, we cannot have nice things like that in this intellectual property. The majority of the imperial population, however, speaks Low Gothic. This isn't really a single language, and it's very poorly defined, and that's on purpose. It's more of a language family or group, since there's no real singular Low Gothic the way there is with High Gothic. It also shows the obvious class divide in the Imperium. The language that the elites speak is High Gothic, and it's almost the exact same across the entire galaxy. Meanwhile, the vast number of different languages spoken by countless communities are just all lumped together and called something like Low Speak. But when we engage with the setting, of course, we do so in our own language, usually English. This is, after all, an English franchise. But even then, there are interesting phrases and terms used throughout that we can all understand. I've already mentioned that throne is a word used a lot by many different characters in many different stories. For some characters, it's a source of authority, but for many, it's a word used when they're distressed. People say things like, for throne's sake, or throne damn it. It's used the same way people in our world might say things like, for heaven's sake, or for the love of God. The throne in the Imperium has basically taken the place of God and heaven in people's speech. There's also plenty of instances where people use the word emperor in the same way. Games Workshop does this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it shows how different and alien the future Imperium is from our own world. It's so different that even the language and how it's used is totally unfamiliar to us. But it also shows just how all-encompassing and totalitarian the Imperium is. It pervades, or at least it tries to pervade, every moment and every thought in people's lives, even down to how they speak casually with one another, or even just to themselves. Now that I've mentioned people cursing and taking the name of the Emperor and his throne in vain, I think that leads really neatly into the next part of Imperial propaganda that I want to talk about. It's state religion. Okay, first of all, let's get this out of the way. I know the Emperor never wanted to be a god, or at least that's what he claimed during the Great Crusade and his early conquests. There's some debate, and I think it's a very strong debate to be had, about how serious the Emperor really was when he spoke about the imperial truth. That was the philosophy in the early Imperium that championed atheism and violently discouraged religious belief. It was supposed to be a unifying idea. Mankind needed to embrace reason, science, and unity, not superstition. But during the course of the Great Crusade, the Emperor himself started to be worshipped as a god, seemingly against his own wishes. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that he didn't want this, but I'm not here to say definitively whether he did or didn't. He was inconsistent. On the one hand, he clearly went out of his way to mock his own followers for their religious faith. He ridiculed them in private, like in The Last Church, one of the few stories where we get to hear him speak plainly. But on the other hand, he used religious symbolism, iconography, and language when he was building the foundations of the Imperium. I mean, the campaign to unite humanity across the stars was literally called the Great Crusade, a religious term. He called some of his space marines angels, and he definitely went out of his way to show how far above others he really was. One of the most important figures in this shift was Lorgar, also one of the most unpopular figures as well. He was the Primarch of the Wordbearers Legion. He was one of the first to openly worship the Emperor as a god in an organised way. He essentially created the foundation for what would later become the imperial cult, the state religion that still exists 10,000 years later in the setting. When the Emperor discovered that Lorgar had delayed his conquests in order to more firmly establish his growing religion, he punished the Wordbearers Legion. Their supposedly perfect city of Monarchia was destroyed, and the entire legion was forced to kneel before the Emperor. On the surface, this was done to humiliate them, to show them what it meant to submit to another being through religious devotion. But also, now let's be honest here, the Emperor psychically commanded tens of thousands of genetically engineered super soldiers to just kneel before him. If you're capable of miracles like that, it's hard to blame someone for thinking you might be divine. Either way, the imperial cult did not disappear. The Emperor and his government tried to suppress it at first, but over generations it spread. Eventually it became the state religion of the entire Imperium. Tens of thousands of years after the Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne, his worship became law across hundreds of thousands of worlds. The way many imperial missionaries work is very similar to the early Christian church. For example, when Christian missionaries arrived in Ireland in the 400s, they incorporated pagan beliefs into this new Christian tradition. The well-known example of this is, of course, the Celtic cross, a Christian cross with a circle behind it. That circle was a pre-existing pagan symbol that became part of this new religious icon. Imperial missionaries do something similar. when they arrive on a planet that has never heard of the Imperium, or at least hasn't been in contact for a very long time, they don't just bulldoze local beliefs, they adapt them. Let's say there's a technologically primitive world where people worship a sun god. When Imperial authorities finally show up, whether that's a governor in orbit or an inquisitorial black ship sent to collect psychers, they'll tell the locals that their sun god is literally just another form of the Emperor. It's clever, and honestly, it is genuinely terrifying. The other issue I have with the whole concept of the Imperial truth is the way the Emperor treated the Mechanicum of Mars. Now, even though he claimed to be strictly against any kind of religious faith, he allowed this group to keep their belief system and even encouraged them to see him as their savior, the Omnissiah. I know there's debate about this, but it brings me into the next part of the Imperial propaganda machine. I want to talk about how they view and how they withhold technology. Okay, so look, we all love the Mechanicus. I know we all do. The Mechanicus, the Mechanicum, whatever era you're talking about. But at the end of the day, they are also a perfect example of just how the Imperium's government exerts even more control over its own population. In universe, there are plenty of reasons why an organization like this exists and why it's so skeptical about things like scientific advancement and progress. About 5,000 years before the Great Crusade, there was the Cybernetic Revolt, when thinking machines turned on their human masters and destroyed the first interstellar human empire. That catastrophe brought about 5 millennia of chaos known as the Age of Strife. As a result, artificial intelligence was outlawed basically everywhere humanity had settled, and the scars of that event are still being felt thousands of years later. The Mechanicum, as a faction, started on Mars, originally one of the first human colonies, and one of the first planets to be terraformed. It was transformed into a lush, green paradise. But over the course of the Age of Strife, that terraforming was largely undone. Mars became a harsh place once again, and the human population struggled to survive. The group that eventually rose to dominance was the Mechanicum. They chose to worship the remnants of technology left behind in the ruins. They believed that the machine god had already revealed all knowledge to humanity and that it was their sacred duty to recover, preserve, and guard that knowledge. To that end, they reunited the planet, searched the ancient ruins, and unearthed long-lost technology. Once they had the means, they began sending out colony ships to reclaim more knowledge wherever they could find it. When they eventually made contact with Earth again, or Terra as it eventually became known, they basically saw it as a lost cause. It wasn't worth bothering with, for the most part anyway, until the Emperor showed up. Now there's a few things going on here. The Emperor knew that Mars had already created an interstellar empire of its own, one that was far more technologically advanced than what he had on Terra at the time. So by allying with Mars, he could jumpstart the Great Crusade. In fact, it's entirely possible that the Imperium could not have conquered the galaxy if it were not for the forges of Mars. The Martians believed the Emperor was their divine savior, a physical embodiment of the machine god, the Omnissiah. And unlike Lorgar's religious devotion, the Emperor allowed this belief to persist. He incorporated the Mechanicum's empire into his own, politically and peacefully, using their faith to secure their loyalty. It's worth noting here that during the Horus Heresy, half of the Mechanicum sided with the traitors, and the rest stayed loyal and evolved into the modern Adeptus Mechanicus. There's another aspect of this relationship that I don't think gets talked about enough. By making the Imperium entirely reliant on the Mechanicus for advanced technology, the Emperor and his successors in the High Lords limited how far that technology could spread. Yes, there are plenty of industrial and civilized worlds that can produce goods and even decently advanced tools, but if you want to build vast fleets of warships, god engines like Titans, or anything truly advanced, you will need the Forge worlds run by the Mechanicus. And remember, this is now an organization that fully worships the Emperor as a god. Their entire belief system is built around the pursuit and use of lost knowledge, all in service of the Omnissiah. If you dig a little deeper, it goes even further than that. One of the many things Warhammer borrows from the Dune series is the absence of artificial intelligence. In Dune, AIs were replaced with human beings trained to act like computers, the Mentats. Warhammer 40k takes the same idea and, of course, makes it much more depressing. Which leads us to one of the darkest parts of Imperial propaganda and control: servitors. The thing is, you cannot have an interstellar, galaxy-spanning empire without using some way of calculating better than the human brain is naturally capable of. Unless, of course, our understanding of the universe fundamentally changes between the recording and you listening to this video. You will need computers if you want to explore and conquer the galaxy. How the Imperium gets around the need for thinking machines in Warhammer 40k is simple. They don't really use them. Yes, they have simple and functional computers like we would know them, and they're called cogitators. Some of them are probably better than what we currently have in the real world. But based on the taboo against artificial intelligence and the theocratic nature of the Mechanicus, they cannot use true AI. So while they do have computers, they don't have any machines that can properly think, at least not that they're aware of. Okay, this is a bit of a digression here, but there are stories in the lore about AIs that survived the cybernetic revolt and are still hiding in the galaxy. That's neither here nor there. So how does the Imperium and the Mechanicus get around this prohibition on artificial intelligence? Well, they just use people, of course. Servitors are one of the worst and also best elements of the Warhammer 40k setting, in a way anyway. They're certainly one of the most grimdark elements of the lore. They are people who have been cybernetically augmented in various different ways to perform specific functions. These are often tasks that would be difficult or outright impossible for a regular, unaugmented human to do. Sometimes, however, they're assigned to functions that would be perfectly suited to simple technology. There are examples of servitors being used for the sole purpose of controlling automatic doorways, or for things like loading and unloading cargo. They may also be sometimes seen on the battlefield. It is very rare for someone to willingly give their life to be used like this. Usually, the biological components for these cyborgs are vat-grown, but a lot of the time, servitors come from the criminal population of whatever their origin world is. These people are lobotomized and they have different parts of their bodies replaced with cybernetic attachments. This is the Imperium now, so of course, sometimes this doesn't go very well. There are stories in the lore from the point of view of servitors, and in some cases they can retain some memories or even some level of consciousness. Yet they have no control over their bodies and are kept in a permanent state of labour, doing whatever task their new form has been designed to do. Even in those cases where they've fully lost consciousness and are functioning properly, they are still abhorrent. Can you imagine a relative gets arrested for protesting the objectively tyrannical government of the Imperium and is turned into one of these things as punishment? There is every possibility that you could see your loved one forced into this horrific fate. I think it's actually one of the worst things about the Imperium. Using the threat of being turned into a servitor, a fate far worse than death for most people, as a punishment for a crime is genuinely abhorrent. Especially when you consider that one of the crimes we've seen people get this punishment for is sedition, which in the Imperium might be something as simple as stealing food to feed your starving children. Of course, in this universe there are plenty of characters who see being turned into a servitor as an honour. In that state they are able to continue their service to the God Emperor and his Imperium for far longer than any natural human lifetime. But the threat of this happening to an Imperial citizen is constant. Different Games Workshop writers have said that Mechanicus tech priests and servitors are about as common in the Imperium as cars are in the modern world. The Imperium doesn't always have to tell people what it could do to them, it can simply show them. But of course, it'll tell them anyway. What would a good totalitarian nightmare of a state be without a healthy dose of censorship and mass media manipulation? There are all sorts of examples of information control in Warhammer 40k lore. Planets we know are terrible places to live are described to the citizens of the Imperium as paradises. There's propaganda of agricultural worlds being described as full of idyllic farming communities when in reality they can be some of the most industrialised and depressing parts of the Imperium. One of the most heavily censored parts of Imperial history is definitely its foundation, around the time of the Great Crusade. Most Imperial subjects will be fully aware of the loyal Primarchs. Many view them in the same way Catholics view saints or Christ's disciples. Yet they often remain blissfully unaware of the traitor Primarchs. Even some very high-ranking members of the Inquisition have been shown to be shocked upon learning of their existence. One of the greatest ironies here, and one of the best parts of 40k lore in general, is Lectitio Divinitatus. I think I'm saying that correctly. I'm probably getting a load of words wrong, to be honest with you. This book was created by the Primarch of the Wordbearers Legion, Lorgar, that guy again. It was essentially his manifesto, his belief in the Emperor as a divine being, worthy of worship as the god of mankind. This book has changed greatly since its original form during the Great Crusade. It's functionally the Imperium's equivalent of the Holy Bible. The origin of this text has become more common knowledge among the very elite of the imperial leadership, but there are still entire sections of the Inquisition devoted to the suppression of knowledge just like this. In many ways, though, this is actually one of the best things about the lore of Warhammer 40k. Most of the people of the Imperium don't really know what's going on. The leadership don't really know what's going on either. In fact, I don't know if there are many characters that are aware of exactly what's going on in front of them, let alone the wider galaxy. This is how the Imperium was written by Games Workshop. It's supposed to be contradictory. It's a mess of unreliable narrators, to the extent that not only do they not really know what's going on, neither do we. We don't know if the Emperor truly believed in the Imperial truth. We don't know if he actually wanted to be worshipped as a god, or if it was a means to an end, or if it was something else entirely. We don't know an awful lot about what actually is going on in the Imperium, and that is by design. It's one of the things that creates so much debate around this setting among its fanbase. One thing is for certain though, the Imperium is, by and large, a terrible place to live. One where you are constantly surrounded by reminders that your government is capable of many different things. But the thing it is most capable of is violence against its own citizens, be that direct, economic, ideological, or otherwise. So, I hope you enjoyed that video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you have anything to add, please do reach out. I tried to read all the comments and respond as best I can. This is a new channel, so please like, subscribe. It all matters a huge deal, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.